okay, but at the end of it all, Muslims were blamed, and the rationale was is that Muslims could not accept foreign rule. Well, Sayyid Ahmad Khan argued against that notion, that in fact, as long as Muslims were free to live their lives according to their religion, there was no reason for them to rebel. There was no religious rationale for that. And he had a very, very modernist view of the Quran. He held that the Quran, much more so than the Bible, was actually compatible with, say, modern science. He argued that the Copernicus system was there, using some of the same verses that Abdu'l-Baha will later use to argue that the Copernicus system was actually in the Quran. I think he even argued, for evolution in those ways. But in any case, he tried to show that Islam was actually the perfect natural religion. Okay? In some ways, in that way, he was the first modernist, but there was a problem with that because he was making an apology to the British and say, hey, we're fine with British rule. Okay? Well, not all Muslims were fine with British rule. Okay? Here's someone who really kind of came out in strong opposition to Sayyid Ahmad Khan. His name is Jamal ad-Din Afghani. Okay? That just means the Afghan. The Afghan is what is the last part. But he really wasn't Afghan at all. He was Persian. Okay? He was from Iran, Hamadan, as far as I recall. But the reason he called himself an Afghan is because he was arguing for a pan-Islam movement to resist Western imperialism. I don't know how religious the man really was, but he's really kind of the first one to use, I guess, Islam as a modern political ideology. And that makes him important in that sense. He actually starts out with his activities in Iran, okay? The Iranian government had sold concessions of tobacco to certain entrepreneurs from the West. Well, the thing is that Iran grows its own tobacco. Yet they were handing over a monopoly of its growing, its sale, its distribution, all of that there. Well, what Jamal ad-Din Afghan did was he wrote to a very famous Ayatollah. His name was Shirazi. Some have argued that he was secretly a Baha'i. We don't know that for sure. But in any case, and said, look, we can't let these Western imperialists get away with this thing. So Ayatollah Shirazi declared smoking tobacco to be haram, to be forbidden in Islam. And believe it or not, an entire nation stopped smoking. We need to box that, sell it somehow. But what he also does, and this kind of fits in with his name, Afghani, is he was pretending to be a Sunni and declaring that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was the Caliph and that all Muslims ought to recognize him as such and sort of rally behind him. And of course, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, he loved that. Until one of Afghan's followers got the Shah killed. At first, they blamed this on the Baha'is and killed a number of them, and then finally decided it was Afghani's followers. And so the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire felt a little bit threatened by his presence and had him poisoned to death. But this pan-Islam movement is going to have quite a bit of effect on there. By the way, if I can just go back here a little bit, notice the difference in headdresses here. This kind of headdress here, Taj, it's actually kind of a compromise with the West. It is Westernization as well, because what it's meant to imitate is a Western-style hat, but without a brim. Muslims don't want to wear a hat with a brim because then they want to cover their heads when they pray. A brim's going to get in the way when they bow down. So this was kind of the compromise they arrived at, was these kind of tall hats, but brimless. And they were considered kind of a sign of modernity. I see I forgot an element here, which is the Tanzimat reforms within the Ottoman Empire, where they actually tried to make the Ottoman Empire more of a constitutional monarchy with due process. I don't think they weren't thinking in terms of democracy, although there was a Janissary revolt in the 18th century where they actually thought about, and it occurred just about the time as the French Revolution, where they actually toyed with the idea of forming a republic. But the clerics, the ulama, said, no, no, we can't have that. But in any case, they try to put in lots of reforms that basically made Muslims and non-Muslims equal. And by the way, a lot of the minorities didn't like that a bit, because yes, for a while before this they had to pay a poll tax, but it exempted them from the military. And now that exemption from the military was being taken away. They didn't like that at all. But in any case, so that was more of the technology part of it, you know, whereas here we're getting more into the religious dimension here. Muhammad Abduh is an Egyptian who starts out as a follower of Afghani's pan-Islam movement. He also was somewhat of a revolutionary in terms of trying to get rid of the British. He gets arrested, imprisoned, but when he gets released, he really kind of gives birth to a much more modern leaning Islam, where he basically says you have to, Islam and the modern world have to come to terms with one another. Now, Muhammad Abduh, well, he gets kicked out of Egypt for a while, ends up in Lebanon. And this is about the time, by the way, that the Baha'is have been, Baha'u'llah has been exiled to Akka in Israel. And both Abdul Baha and Muhammad Abduh kind of become part of a circle of intellectuals in Lebanon. You know, Lebanon is going to be a very important place for a lot of kind of modernist thinking. Partly it's because, yes, there were a lot of Christians there, and missionaries often came to establish universities there. There were French high schools and universities. There was also the Syrian Protestant University that was started by American Presbyterians. What's interesting about the American Presbyterians, and by the way, that is today called the American University of Beirut, what is interesting about them is that they taught nationalism to the Arabs. Because remember, the Arab world outside of Egypt, and of course Persia is not part of the Arab world, but neither is Afghanistan, but they basically urged them to learn Arabic literature, you know, and kind of help foster Arab resentment against Ottoman rule, which was Turkish after all. Okay, so some people have argued for good reason that Arab nationalism is actually going to be born at the Syrian Protestant College. Now, one thing that's interesting, Abdul Baha doesn't go there, but he enters into this dialogue with all of these important intellectuals, out of which I believe comes a text known as The Secret of Divine Civilization, where he basically says, yes, we need to develop all of these modern arts and sciences, and we also need to have elected boards of consultation. Okay, this is was another important thing here, but he basically says, but if our leaders aren't righteous, if our leaders aren't high-minded, it's not going to help. That was kind of the push of his. He published it anonymously in 1875, and it ends up in libraries all over the place, but they don't know it's written by a Baha'i. But I think there is some good reason to think it did have a significant amount of influence. Certainly, Muhammad Abduh was very impressed with Abdul Baha. Muhammad Abduh ends up going back to Egypt, and he becomes the Sheikh al-Islam of Al-Azhar University, which is, Al-Azhar University is the oldest university in the world in Egypt, and so he was basically the head of that university for some time. By the way, it's a lot more conservative today than it was in Muhammad Abdu's time. But he was Muhammad Abdu was a very, very impressive figure in terms of Islamic modernism. But I'm going to go back to India now for a minute, because I want to talk about another movement which is perhaps a bit more reactionary, and I'm going to call that Islamic revivalism, okay? And by the way, it arises just about the same time as, the First and Second Great Awakenings in the Americas. I don't think that's an accident, by the way, because one thing that happens in the 18th century is that mass literacy is spreading all over the place. In the Islamic world, part of what's helping that spread is the introduction of the printing press. Muslims had gotten a lot of things from China. The Chinese had invented the printing press to begin with, but printing they didn't get because they had so many clerks, and the book everybody wanted was the Quran, and it seemed, Qurans ought to be written in beautiful calligraphy, so until they come up with lithographs and things like that, they're not going to be terribly interested in it. But the 18th century, they start coming up with newspapers, and newspapers are become big in the West as well. And that kind of leads to a mass literacy, but at kind of a low level, so that you have a lot of literalism, both within Christianity and within the Islamic world. But there's something else fitting into this too, and that was some stuff that was going on in India at the time. This is the time of the Mughals' rule, and we're really kind of starting that story towards the end of the 16th century. The kinds of Muslims, the Muslims who are most responsible for spreading Islam throughout the world, get rid of the idea from your head that Islam was spread by the sword. No, the Islamic Empire was spread by the sword, but people became Muslims much, much slower. Iran is going to be conquered, but it'll be 3 centuries later before the majority of the population will be Islamicized, which doesn't really point to forcible conversion. And the people and it's really not until about the 9th century, 12th, even later, that we start to have so many conversions that Islam becomes the huge religion it is today. And it was largely Sufis that did it. Sufism is a form of Islamic mysticism, okay? And mysticism being kind of a cultivation of a sense of oneness with God. And that, if what you're stressing about your religion is your personal experience with God, after a while you find out other people have kind of the same experiences. And Sufis were better able to build bridges between religions. The traditional clergy, we call them the ulama, that would be off in the mosque. They, in the cities, big urban areas, they didn't want non-Muslims coming in, the mosque and, Quran. And, well, you don't let people go to your houses of worship. You don't let them read your holy books. How in the world are they going to convert? Sufis, on the other hand, would set up these retreat houses out in the countryside, where most of the people who were not yet Islamicized lived, and they would impress people with their holiness. But as any good Catholic can tell you, the best saint is always a dead one. Why? Well, when a saint dies, you build a shrine over them, okay? And people come to pray at the shrines. In the Islamic world, especially women will do this, okay? And very gradually, the population will become Islamicized. It comes to be associated with miracles and things like that. A lot of popular religion gets put into this. Well, Akbar, the Mughal Empire under Akbar, very much encouraged this kind of syncretism going on. His grandson, for instance, translated the Upanishads, the great Hindus, some of the Hindu scriptures into Persian, etc. And Akbar saw himself as the mediator between all of the religions of the world. Well, some of the traditional ulama were astounded, were horrified by this. But Akbar had a way of dealing with religious dissidents. He would basically say, oh, you're so religious, you're so holy. Here's a one-way ticket to Mecca. And he'd send them out on pilgrimage and suggest they not come back. Well, these people who opposed Akbar's universalism and had him and sort of blamed it all on Sufism end up as Quran teaching hadith. Hadiths are stories about the Prophet in Medina, okay? And the thing about the Muslim pilgrimage is it brings Muslims together from all over the world, and usually you don't just go there, go home again, especially not in those days. People would usually stay in Medina, they'd study for maybe for years, but at least for some time, and they'd come back, and it would be assumed they're now a learned man, and everyone would address them as Haji and whatnot. Okay?
Dr. Maneck, can I interrupt here? Sorry.
Yeah.
Are your slides moving along? You're still on the same slide, or do you want to keep going on your slides?
Has the slides not changed?
No, we're still in the first one.
Oh my gosh. Oh. Let me see. I'm glad you told me because I'm about halfway through them. Let's see. How do I get that? What do I do? Sabina, are you there? I don't know what to do.
Sabina's our tech support here.
I'm there. I'm just moving forward.
Because I thought they were seeing the slides as I went through them. Apparently they're not, and now I'm not seeing it on my screen share.
Keep talking.
Oh, wait a minute, I see something up there. Okay.
Your flow there. You were doing great.
Well, that's the problem is, that wasn't the point for this, right? Okay. Let me try that again.
Yeah, no worries.
It disappears.
Gives everybody a chance at intermission to use the
Do you see that now?
I don't
Do you see this now?
No, I just see you.
I can't figure out how to go back there. I mean, I'm finding it.
There you are.
There? You see it there? Okay, this is Muhammad Ali that I talked about before. Yes, I wish you had said it when I started talking about the headdress, because obviously I thought you were seeing something. Yeah, this is kind of their compromise with modernity in this headdress here. Okay, can you see this picture now?
What slide are you on?
I'm on the third slide.
There you are. Now you have it.
Okay, so this is Jamal ad-Din Afghan, Pan-Islam, Muhammad Abdul, the Egyptian, and this is Abdul Baha. Okay, now can you see this one?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I better not put it into the full slideshow then. That seems to be the problem. Okay, this is the Emperor Akbar, by the way. Okay, are you seeing this one?
Yes.
Okay, if I do this, can you still see it? Whoops. Are you seeing it still?
We see, we went to the title. We see Jamal ad-Din Afghan.
Okay, can you see this one now, Islamic Revivalism?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Here's something that's interesting. In the 18th century, we're going to have kind of three movements that are going to share a lot of things in common that are part of Islamic revivalism. And what's interesting is all three of these men studied under these exiles from India that had, and later on some of them get exiled by the British as well. We're going to have the Mahdi movement of the Sudan, and we're going to have Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, from which we get the term Wahhabism, in Arabia, not yet Saudi Arabia, mind you. Okay, and then we're going to have Sayyid Ahmad Barlavi in India. Okay, you know, these were basically movements that are going to share a certain amount of things in common. And I would argue that this is kind of the roots of some of the modern day terrorist groups that we've got, okay? Now, the Wahhabis, for a time in the 18th century, got control of the area around Mecca and Medina. As I recall, they even destroyed the Prophet's shrine because they were so anti-Sufi, nobody should pray at the shrine, even if it's a shrine of the Prophet. And they went around killing Sufis, as a matter of fact. And really, by the end of it, Sufism almost dies out completely in the heartlands, you know, in the areas we often call the Middle East today. It will still persist in places like Indonesia and India and so on and so forth. And by the way, South and Southeast Asia has more Muslims by far than does the Middle East. Only 15% of the Muslims in the world live in the Middle East. But what goes on in the Middle East certainly does have a big impact on what's there afterwards. The Wahhabis in the 18th century were considered an exceedingly dangerous heresy. Okay? And they were eventually put down. They will re-arise thanks to kind of an alliance they formed with the family of Ibn Saud, and after World War I, and managed to take over most of the Arabian Peninsula, and hence we have what's called modern-day Saudi Arabia. But this is sort of where its origins start, in the latter part of the 18th century, and it was considered a dangerous heresy. And I'm going to explain here. Can you see this slide? I know it's got much too much text on it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. Can I interrupt here, Dr. Maneck?
Yeah.
And we have a quick question from one of the students.
Okay, let me just...
Go ahead.
Should I go check and see what the chat says, or?
Or I can read it to you, whichever you prefer.
Oh, well, I'm over here now. Let's see. How were the Sufis... Okay. The roots of their modern terrorist groups is with revivalism, not with Sufism, but those that were trying to do them in, actually. How were they recruited? They pretty much recruited themselves because they wanted to retreat from the cities. They really weren't, I mean, a lot of them were merchants, okay? What we're going to end up with is we're going to have a bunch of Sufi brotherhoods. But I don't know, and yes, though, as merchants, they'll share their religion wherever they go, places like Indonesia, India, and stuff like that. But they're not paid missionaries like in the Christian sense of the word. Islam's never going to have anything similar to that. And they just basically would go to these retreat houses at first kind of temporarily, but they really preferred those kinds of things. Okay? Anyhow, was there any other question? Are those the main ones? Okay, I think we've got it, right? All right, let me get back to our slides. You're seeing this? Okay. Now, here's kind of the difference between Islamic revivalism and these revivalist groups, out of which grow most of the jihadists and whatnot, and sort of what would be considered more orthodox form of Sunni Islam. Number one is the idea that the gate of interpretation remains open. Most Sunnis actually believe that it was closed in the 9th century. They have 4 schools of Islam. You can pick whichever one you want to belong to, but you ought to follow their interpretations. You might think that, hey, isn't that a good thing? And by the way, for Shiites, the gate of interpretation is still open, at least if you're an Ayatollah. Now, if you're just a regular person, you can't simply interpret Islamic law for yourself, but you can pick an Ayatollah and follow whatever he says. But Sunnis believed it was closed, and yet these new revivalists are kind of reopening it. And by the way, the modernists will end up doing that as well, generally speaking, because they begin to think of, why can't an elected legislature, and they'll almost always call legislatures bodies of consultation, Majlis, Shura, etc., why can't they exercise interpretation as well? But in any case, but here's the real important one for what we see going on today. And that's their belief in something called takvir wa hijra. Okay, I'm wanting to pronounce it in Persian. Takvir basically means to declare somebody an infidel, an ingrate. Kafir actually means ingrate more than infidel, but it usually gets done anyhow. And wahidra means to immigrate. And the idea here is that it's impermissible for a Muslim to live in a country not governed by Islamic law without seeking either to overthrow the country or make it Islamic. Otherwise, they should immigrate to a place that's truly Muslim. This grows out of a lot of the conflicts in India originally, but you can see how it would be applied today. Most Sunnis basically don't have a problem as long as their religion, living in a different country under different rules, as long as their own religious beliefs aren't being persecuted. Okay? Here's another one. The belief that any nominally Muslim country which does not abide by the Sharia or Islamic law is therefore really apostate, and therefore it should be overthrown and its leaders killed. This was considered a terribly heretical belief. And it still is. When Muslims themselves want to criticize some of these jihadist groups, they almost always call them Kharijites. Okay, now Kharijites was a sect in early Islam that was responsible for assassinating Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, who Shiites believe was the rightful leader of the Islamic world. And they were really considered dangerous heretics by both Sunnis and Shiites alike. And they'll usually, there's no historical connection between Islamic revivalism and the Kharijites that existed, say, in the 9th century or earlier. But they're saying the same beliefs. And when like I said, a Muslim wants to criticize them, they'll almost always call them a Kharij. And usually they do want to criticize them. The other thing is the difference in which religious minorities get treated, okay? Generally speaking, Christians and Jews are regarded in Islam as what's called Ahl Kitab, or people of the book. And within an Islamic context, they were allowed to practice their own religion, etc. Well, the revivalists wanted to treat them as infidels. And were often willing to persecute them. And of course, we see that with ISIS today. Although ISIS, there's another dimension, which hopefully we'll get to here. All right, let's see. Oops. I made a new slide. I didn't mean to do that. Okay. Here's where can you see this slide?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. This is kind of where revivalism meets modernism. Rashid Rida was originated as a follower of Muhammad Abduh, who I said was one of our great modernists. He starts out as a modernist, but he seems to have adopted it somewhere along the line a lot of Wahhabi ideas. And that gives birth to a movement we call the Salafi. Okay? Salafi basically means the ancestors. And the idea is, let's go back to the Muslim community as it existed in Medina and imitate what they do. Well, any revivalist movement that tries to go back, you know, whether you're going to go back to early Christianity at the time of Christ and the apostles, etc., you actually end up reinventing it, you know, and that's inevitable, okay? And, of course, that ends up to be what happens here. But here's now where we get a much more militant aspect to that. After a while, we also have in the early 20s and 30s the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was founded by Hassan al-Banna, okay? And basically what they started to do is they were Salafi as well, but they set up a lot of social programs, schools, doctors, etc., which made them very popular with the common people. But they could have a militant side to them as well. and they will increasingly over time have one. Hamas actually is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And here's where it gets kind of the ideologues of actual terrorism. And one ideologue is a man by the name of Sayyid al-Qutb in Egypt. You see him behind bars there. Okay. And another one was Maududi in India. Maududi's a really interesting one, especially if we think about what's going to happen with ISIS. Because Maududi adds kind of an apocalyptic edge to this. He wrote a book called The Finality of Prophethood, which was an attack on two groups, the Ahmadiyas and the Baha'is. But think of his text kind of like a Muslim version of the late great Planet Earth. If any of you can remember that book, Hal Lindsey and whatnot. I think he's changed his scenario now to fit current events. They tend to do that. But Maududi kind of depicts this whole battle of Armageddon, which, by the way, is a real place, where the Muslims, led by the Mahdi and Jesus, interestingly enough, Jesus is supposed to return at the end of time, and they will lead the Muslim forces against the Christians and Jews in the great battle of Armageddon. Okay? And that's kind of a background for Maududi. But there are a couple of other elements that are going to end up in here, and that really come from the West and aren't particularly Islamic at all. One is the right to rebel. Okay, the Kharijites kind of have that too. If they're not truly a Muslim leader, overthrow them. But generally speaking, I think a good argument could be made that the revolutions in the West in the course of the 19th century helped kind of to fuel it, that there came to be a sense of you have the right to overthrow your government, something that Sunnis in general would not have accepted. The other element that enters in, especially after the World War II, in the course of the World War I and World War II, is the notion of total war. If one reads in the Sharia, Islamic law, what the rules of war are, they're very strict. You can't target women and children. You can't even cut down a tree. So how do you end up with suicide bombers blowing everybody up? Well, you're not going to get it out of Islam, actually. Part of what it comes from is the growing way war is being waged in the West, such that everything becomes a military target because all of society has to be mobilized for war. Okay? I mean, that's what justified Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if you think about it. Okay? And, for instance, bin Laden's rationale for blowing up the Twin Towers was, even though, yes, there's women and children in there, etc., people that you're not supposed to fire against, but they're contributing to economic imperialism. It's not an accident the target was the world center. Okay? ISIS, of course, grows out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But more so than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had somewhat of an apocalyptic dimension to it. ISIS carries that out kind of to the ultimate ends of things. And by the way, the best book on ISIS right now, in fact, the only decent book I know of, is by Will McCants, M-C-C-A-N-T-S. Which is basically ISIS and how it's apocalyptic stuff, and even has he's gone through all the Arabic, he's read the dialogues between, say, bin Laden and the leaders of ISIS. Al-Qaeda did not want to target Shiites like ISIS does. He did not want to target religious minorities, bin Laden, that were living in the Middle East. For ISIS, it's basically we're fighting an apocalyptic war. We're on our way to Israel, and all holes are barred. There's nothing to sort of stop it. It really has reached its ultimate destination, I guess, as an apocalyptic death cult, is the only way I can describe it. But I think that really, in some sense, goes back to Maududi here. Okay, now I need to leave some room because I've gone 45 minutes, haven't I? And I've gone very fast. You got it. Thank you, Christina. Yes.
No problem. It's a great reference. Really.
So are you familiar with it, or did you just Google it in?
I'm familiar with it already. I actually considered it as one of our textbooks, but decided to go for Richard Engel, which is less academic, but I felt it would be a great introduction to terrorism.
Well, I think I'm going to be teaching the Middle East again next fall, and I think I'm going to be using. I always try to find one that's keeping up with the current events, and so so this year it's ISIS, right? Yeah, my Middle East course, I have to change it every single year.
Yeah.
And make a whole new thing because everything changes there so fast.
It changes so quickly, but the main themes, like what you're talking about, and the growth of these groups over time, that's kind of where I've taken this course, is understanding the evolution of it over time, because it's going to continue to change, but you can map out these changes based on the evolution.
Yes, I see you made a comment about Rabia, who was a female Muslim mystic who lived in the 8th century. She wrote, "If I love thee in fear of hell, may I burn in hell. If I love thee in hope of paradise, withhold me from paradise. But if I love thee for thine own sake,
One of my
bar me not from the I forgot for the beauty of thy face." That's how it goes.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's impressive that you have that memorized.
I once made a poster of it to keep the fire insurance salesman away.
Well, she was definitely eccentric, and I like that. I like that a lot.
So I have tried to give you 2 centuries of Islamic history in 45 minutes.
That is impressive for 45 minutes.
But yeah, that is the book, and I highly recommend everybody take a look at it. Did you find it a hard read?
Not really. I mean, I felt it flowed very nicely for students. I think that next semester or next quarter, are you thinking about using that book next quarter?
I think I'm going. Yeah, I've already got it downloaded on my Kindle. You can get a Kindle if you want to go to sleep to ISIS for some weird reason. I have it on I have it on an audio book even. You wash the dishes talking about ISIS, right? But it's an inexpensive book, so it's good that way. And I don't think it's that long, is it?
It's not. I think the reason why I had already they have 2 textbooks. One textbook is very date and name heavy, like very, very date and name heavy, and so for the other textbook, I tried to limit the amount of names and make it like flow more narrative-like, which is why I went for Richard Engel. But if this is going to be like your main textbook, I think it would be great. It's very name heavy, which sometimes can confuse students, especially, I mean, obviously modern names that they hear, like Osama bin Laden or
yeah.
They know these names, but like the older ones, they're not familiar with.
Yeah, there's another article that he wrote called "Islamic Scripture is Not the Problem," and I think what modernism is not the. I can't remember. He wrote it in reaction, and my mind is slipping me. The lady who lives in Holland now, but she's from Somalia, and she kind of writes a lot of anti-Islamic stuff. Although she was raised Muslim, and she says, well, we just need to sponsor Islamic modernism. Well, anything we sponsor, they're not going to go for, right? Because we sponsored it, right? But, if they think it's a plot on our part.
Exactly. I mean, I think for my students, if you guys are really interested in ISIS and you really want to know more about the history and you want to know more about where ISIS ideology comes from, I definitely recommend McCant's book, like Dr. Maneck says. It's just understand that you're going to have to kind of dredge through a lot of names you're unfamiliar with, a lot of words you're unfamiliar with. And, I mean, if you can take that on, then you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah. He used to run a website called Jihadica, which I haven't seen recently, but it was the only decent website on jihadist groups. Most of the other ones are run by people that are spitting as much blood as the jihadists, If you know what I mean.
I know
Uh,
exactly what you mean.
you know, most of them are just hate websites. That's all I can say about them. But
Yeah, you don't
it's
really
like,
get the yeah, you don't really get the unbiased. It's not that you can get any unbiased opinion, but you get significantly more bias than what you're looking for.
yeah, I mean, actually, he was kind of working with the State Department with a lot of his work and stuff like that. So he really does know, and he has sympathy for Islam, not to distort it, you know,
Yeah, exactly.
and make it look like all Muslims are terrorists or whatnot. That this is kind of, you know, and of course, I didn't talk about that Saudi money has made what was originally a very small minority heretical position into something that has attracted much more people. But you know,
Yeah.
um,
Oh, exactly.
and
Yeah.
and 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 I don't think they intended to do it, by the way, because the jihadists hate the Saudis as much as they hate anybody else. But their theology led in that direction almost invariably.
That's so true. Oh my goodness.
I
That's so true. I guess let me open this up for questions for my students. Does anybody? We have a great group here. Do any of you have questions for Dr. Maneck? I know a lot of you are doing your research. Some of you are doing research on terrorist groups. A lot of people this quarter are doing research on women. And so if you have questions, you have a great expert here who has a wonderful knowledge, vast knowledge of the history of this region, which you can use as a foundation of your paper. So this is a good opportunity to ask questions. And as we've talked about, in the Middle East or the whole MENA region, you don't want to be just talking about the present. You need to explain how have things evolved, because how the issue is how your topic has evolved significantly influences the present day. So I just threw a lot of at them, so we'll give them a second to see if they have any questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to write your question up in the chat box. If you want to unmute your mic, we can try that. If we could just do one person at a time. And this is the point where the chat box is like really silent because people are trying to figure out what they want to ask and what they want to write. Or am I just like not seeing the chat box?
noticed you put this little remark about the wardrobe being affected by more for women than men. Actually, if you think about it, more women will keep to traditional dress, you know. Women will still wear saris in India or Punjabi suits and things like that, whereas then the men will more often adopt much more Western dress. I mean, if you look at the Syrian refugees, they don't dress any differently than we do they? Except for the headscarves,
Yep. I think,
you know, and what the
yeah.
women are wearing. And even what
Oh,
the women are wearing is actually kind of a modification of what have been more traditional, you know?
absolutely. I think from the Western side, we tend to focus more on how women are dressed in the Middle East or here rather than men. Oftentimes because women tend to be more conservative in their dress. But
Yes.
as I put out to my students, the MENA region is so diverse, and you'll find in one country, on one side of the MENA region, the wealthy women will dress liberally and the poor women will dress conservatively. But then when you go to the opposite side of the MENA region, you'll find it the absolute opposite. So the extreme diversity of clothing as well as social status can have a
Yeah, and it's kind of
significant.
interesting as to some of these groups. You remember Ahmadinejad never wore a tie,
Yeah,
and that's because some Muslims believe that men should never wear silk, so they shouldn't wear ties. But you may have noticed that our Muslim Brotherhood felt quite comfortable in suits and ties. You
they are. It's kind of it's interesting how they do that.
know?
Yeah, and each terrorist group, they have their own. They definitely have their own culture, their own subculture.
And one of the things that I think Will McCants points out is the way in which some of them are trying to outdo one another
Oh,
by
absolutely.
being more radical than the other group.
ISIS being a perfect example of that.
Yes, and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, Shabab, and they're all vying for each other as to who can be the most radical. But ISIS seems to right now. Well, I don't know. Some of the African groups can get pretty wild as well, but But then the Christian groups in Africa are pretty wild. So.
Oh yes, oh yes. So
The Lord's Resistance Army and stuff.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because like Boko Haram, they tend to mostly operate in Africa. And they've done some pretty impressively horrible things, but yet that stuff does not get broadcast in Western media.
And that's the only something that was widespread in Abdu'l-Baha's time, and that the Secret Divine Civilization was written to resist, is the idea that there's something wrong with Western learning. And Abdu'l-Baha's going, let it in. And in fact, that's the thing that Muhammad Abdul compliments Abdu'l-Baha about, is that, he encourages the arts and sciences. And of course, Boko Haram is the one last recidivist group of them all. I don't know how else to describe it, that we're going to shut out all Western knowledge. Well, even Muhammad Ali had figured out you don't win against the West that way.
No, it doesn't work. You can't get your entire society to go along with your ideology. ISIS is ironically pretty.
Okay, somebody asked about the veil or about the headscarf. Okay, let me address that and maybe address the issue of women in seclusion at the same time. Muhammad's first wife, Khadijah, was not kept veiled and in seclusion, although headscarf seems to have been very common very early on. Both males and females tended to cover their heads, quite frankly. Now, in both the Byzantines and the Sasanian empires that existed during Muhammad's lifetime, the Sasanians being Zoroastrians, the Byzantines being the Christians, it was the custom for elite class women to be kept veiled and in seclusion. That goes all the way back to Mesopotamia, ancient Athens, Greece, etc. So it's a very old thing, but it usually was restricted to really kind of the elite classes. Late in his ministry, Muhammad began to keep his wives veiled and in seclusion, mostly because the followers were constantly kind of interrupting their privacy, and then there was kind of an ugly incident involving his youngest wife, Aisha, where they accused her of some pretty awful stuff. And Muslims, of course, want to follow the example of the Prophet. And some of them will go to the extent of using a stick to clean their teeth with. My father-in-law did that. Because that's the way the Prophet did it. Therefore, that's the way I should do it. But I think the major reason was when they moved into these areas, the egalitarian nature of Islam, ironically, caused a custom that applied mostly to elite women to spread to almost all the urban classes. Never the women in the countryside, it didn't work. But the hijab the headscarf is considered much more a part of the Sharia, whereas wearing a full-face burqa and stuff like that, that's not really something that would be required in Islam. And one thing you have to understand about the Sharia, it's not just simply thou shalt or thou shalt not. There are actually 5 categories of acts. There are those that are required, those that are recommended, what's your neutral on, what is reprehensible, and then finally what's prohibited, and I would say maybe you put a burqa maybe in the recommended category, but it certainly never was required. Okay. Well, one thing that's going to have to happen in that, Joseph was asking a question about the spread of Islam. Well, wow, that would be a big question, because you do end up with a lot of things. A lot of minor deities, for instance, will get integrated in places like Bangladesh as jinn. That happens in Africa as well. And that's kind of one of the ways it will. But also, on the higher level, that's kind of the lowest level. On the higher level, yes, you do have things like, hey, the Upanishads teach the oneness of God too, you know, and you know, so you know, the more contact there is, the more sharing there is, the more opportunities there are for conversions. But the other important thing is going to be trade routes. And actually, what opens up those is going to be the Mongol invasions. When Muslims are no longer ruling these areas, actually, that's when Islam spread as a religion more widely than it ever did any other time in its history. Is when when Muslims are actually no longer in charge. And pretty much the same thing happens in Indonesia. Indonesia is not majority Muslim until the Dutch take over, you know. And then it was sort of like you had to choose sides between the West and there. And Islam in that case kind of became an ideology of resistance. That's, by the way, why Obama's grandfather became a Muslim, even though the family itself was not Muslim previously. They were Christians. So let's see. What else have we got here? I'm trying. Okay. You know who you need to look at for not so much during the period you're looking at, Jordan, but the period, if you're looking for like Islamization in places like Bangladesh, look at a book by Richard Eaton on the Bengal frontier. Because Bangladesh is a very interesting situation as to how Islam spreads. Sort of in the century when Muslims first start moving in, that was an area that was occupied mostly by hunters and gatherers. Muslims invented rice cultivation there. And as people took up farming, they adopted Islam. So there, it's the religion of the plow, not the religion of the sword. And Bangladesh is a very interesting place there. Why did Pakistan originally end up as East and West Pakistan? Why was it even made? Well, you have to understand that the British had once proposed breaking up Bengal. That's what you call the larger area. The India side is called West Bengal. Bangladesh basically means East Bengal. Basically what you had there is you ended up with a bunch of Hindu, in the course of the 18th, 19th centuries, is you ended up with a bunch of urbanite Hindus who became landlords all over all of these Muslim peasants, rice peasants, okay? And then Lord Curzon, who was in the charge, got this bright idea that he was going to split up Bengal in half between his Muslims and Hindu half. Well, the Hindus protested because they didn't want to be divided off from their peasants, and the peasants thought, well, yeah, why not? You know? And it helped, one of the things that sparked it. But one of the other things it started to do was divide Hindus and Muslims against one another. Okay, so that you ended up with a lot of tension there. Originally, Pakistan's actually an acronym. It stands for Punjab, Afghanistan, Kashmir, and Sistan, I guess. I think that's the fourth. Well, it wasn't really part of, Bangladesh wasn't so much part of it. But they're not going to end up with Afghanistan, obviously. Kashmir remains within India because the Maharaja of Kashmir was a Hindu, and Nehru and his family were Kashmiri Brahmins. They weren't about ready to let go of their homeland. You know, I sort of feel like maybe they should have partitioned off Kashmir and kept kept the Punjab and Bangladesh myself. That maybe we'd have a little bit less trouble here. But it's a very, very complicated situation. But the Bengalis, you know, while they were Muslims, they had almost nothing in common with West Pakistan. And West Pakistan, of course, was dominating the whole region. They had more education. Basically, education had not spread very widely into Bangladesh. And it's, of course, it remains today one of the poorest countries in the world, and probably due to global warming, it may even disappear eventually. Um, but so they were never happy with Pakistan. So they try to break off in the 70s. And of course, India is all the willing to help them. But it ends up as a very, very bloody affair. I remember growing up singing Joan Baez's song on Bangladesh and kind of the tragedy that happened there. You know, maybe they should have remained part of it. You know, it's sort of like, I've been to Kashmir, one of the few Americans that has been to Kashmir since it's been shut off from the West for the last several decades. Culturally, they're very different from Indians. Whereas if I meet a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi, except for their religion, I can't see a cultural difference. Kashmiri, completely different. Completely different. Okay. Any more questions, or are we pretty much done?
We have a couple up a little bit further up. Starting with
You missed some questions from Ali and Nicole. Let's see. Okay, is that I've been doing, okay, discrimination, especially within the government as it pertains to the oil fields. I have noticed, please correct me. Okay. No, you're not inventing anything. In fact, the territories that Saddam Hussein tried to grab that led to the Iran-Iraq War, as a matter of fact. And yeah, they're mostly Arab-speaking spokes where the oil is, and there's a bunch of islands that were involved as well that Saddam tried to seize. But yeah, that was kind of what he was after in the first place. And you know, yes, there is a certain amount of tension there, although certainly not all the oil fields are in Arab territories, Arab-speaking territories, but an awful lot of them are. I don't know that I don't know of a lot of literature on that, however. But yes, there is tension there. You're quite correct. Okay, let's see. What else did we have? We had Eileen. Okay. I don't know about, okay, you're asking about the way ISIS is using technology. Well, we all know they're using the internet, okay? I haven't seen so many of the ISIS propaganda ones, but one of them that really kind of encapsulates this apocalyptic dimension as it relates to, say, Al-Qaeda, and which inspired, say, the Boston bombers, marathon bombers. Go look at, I think it's called The Black Flags of Khorasan. Let me see if I can find it here. I think it's, and it's kind of funny because Baha'is use some of these same prophecies, but we do the emergence of prophecy. And you'll see the way they use propaganda. It's amazing. It's about 13 minutes long, but you know, you can see, I think you'll get a feel for how you can get sucked in. This is the video itself.
In the name of Allah.
Well, I won't get it started, but that's the emergence of prophecy is the name of the video. So, and they're very much, you know, using some of the most horrific things as propaganda, and it seems to be working amazingly enough. Now, the other thing is, of course, the whole thing of suicide bombing, okay? The first suicide bombing was carried out by Shiites in the Marine base in Lebanon, interestingly enough. And there's nothing Islamic about suicide bombings. Suicide is not allowed, and then obviously you're targeting, you know, old folks, women, children, all the things that you're forbidden to target under the Sharia. But So why are they using it? Well, I think the main reason was it worked. Because what happened was, let me get that back to where I'm supposed to be here. Go to, okay. It worked, okay? When they blew up the Marine base, the Americans left. And so other Muslims in the Middle East started scratching their heads and say, oh, so this is how you get rid of them, okay? And actually, and this is kind of amazing when you think about how ISIS and the Shiites are at it, but probably one of the reasons that bin Laden wasn't so anti-Shiite is that he sent some people to the Hezbollah to actually learn how to do these things, you know? It's a modern technique. And by the way, people like Ayatollah Khomeini, without the cassette recorder, he never would have been so important. But it was a way of getting his sermons, his message spread all over the place. So they have to use Western media. They have to use Western technology. And they're always going to do that. Let's see. And that's why Boko Haram is the only recidivist out there. And even they're using Western guns. How you make a Western gun if Western learning is prohibited, I don't know. All right, let's see.
The great theory of contradiction.
Okay, Joseph, what was your question about Libya? Or was it about Gaddafi or? Okay, still not clear. By the way, one thing you should understand about Muslims, they regard aerial bombing as an act of terrorism. The Marine base, you're thinking of what happened at Benghazi? The Marine base I'm talking about in Lebanon occurred back in the 80s during the Reagan administration. What got hit in Benghazi, so I'm talking about a much more earlier event that I think alerted, I guess you could say, some of these groups to a technique they could use and seemed to be effective. It's sort of like you couldn't get a gun on board a plane, but who's going to worry about a box cutter? But the only way you're going to bring down a plane with a box cutter is if you take it over and you pilot it yourself into the building, which means you die in the process. Well, we were watching for that. We were watching for bombs on our airplanes, but the idea that someone would actually go down with the plane, nobody thought about, willingly. Still not sure I'm getting what you're asking, though, Joseph. Let's see. Aerial bombing. That's interesting. Yeah, both sides see each other's doing terrorist acts. And drone strikes, they see that as definitely an act of terrorism. I have mixed feelings about it myself. I'm not sure where it stands in terms of international law, but gosh, it sure beats in occupying countries. Let's see.
I think we got everybody's questions so far. Did we miss anybody? So we got Kayla's, we got Eileen's.
I'm not sure I got Joseph's, but.
Okay. Oh, no worries. He'll let us know if he's not quite sure.
Okay.
Did we tackle?
Okay, good. He said I did.
Did we get Nicole's on Iran?
I think I said I didn't have a whole lot of information, but she is exactly right, that the oil fields are in the Arab-speaking part, and that's part of what Saddam was trying to get a hold of in the Iran-Iraq war.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions for Dr. Maneck?
Okay, so if the U.S. bombs the Middle East, would they feel like we were terrorized? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Aerial, you have to understand, Africa was the first place that was ever subject to aerial bombing. Originally, Europeans just felt that was something totally unacceptable to use against one another. And it doesn't really get used until World War II with the Battle of Britain. And that came as a shock, you know. But it was sort of originally, it was kind of like, there's a good book you ought to look at. It's called, it doesn't have footnotes, which means so historians, but it's called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And it's written by a Marxist Muslim, I guess you could say, from South Africa, who really kind of shows that a lot of our perceptions are a little bit distorted, and to understand what's going on, you kind of have to go back to, the history of terrorism and genocide in general, and accept the premise that never again ought to be never again against anybody. Well, I wouldn't call what we were doing in Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis had, of course, invited it. That's not terrorism, that's pollution. you know. In other words, we were polluting their holy places by being anywhere near the Hijaz area. And there's a big debate, is the Hijaz just the immediate area around Mecca and Medina? Should it apply to the entire Arabian Peninsula or whatnot, that you ought not to have unbelievers? But it's more of an, it's more of a, it's considered polluting, rather than that. And therefore, and that's why, by the way, they hate the Saudi government as much as they hate us. Even though, yes, their backbone is the Wahhabism, which the family of Ibn Saud made the state religion, I guess. But we have kind of a funny idea. I do remember when, during the original Gulf War, you may remember that Saddam was firing scuds off everywhere and hitting almost nothing. And finally he hit a canteen where some American soldiers were done. And I remember the reporter getting all choked up about this dastardly act of terrorism. Well, that's not terrorism. That's a legitimate military target, which if you were at war. In fact, it was the only legitimate military target that he had hit. I think we have to be more specific. Terrorism is the targeting of civilians, of non-combatants. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to do aerial bombing. We're getting better at it. But not, and avoid there. But, we blew up a hospital in Afghanistan. We've blown up funerals and weddings and things like that. So... Okay. All right, are we all done then?
Okay, so yeah, I think we should probably wrap this up.
Okay.
Dr. Maneck, I want to thank you so much
Okay, sure.
For your time and for your wisdom. I feel like the questions asked, these students have gotten a lot out of your talk.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
I really emphasized what we've been trying to do this quarter in terms of understanding where the state that we're in today, where that came from. I think you really touched on that just perfectly. Let me bring in Zabina. How are you doing?
Yes, I am right here. And Dr. Susan Maneck, I was mightily impressed with your very flexible and broad presentation that I certainly personally enjoyed over here. And I like to think that our students got a lot out of that. And I know that we realize that webinars is a technique that we're still all getting better at all the time. You were very amazingly comfortable and clearly well informed, and managed to work your way around. And so really, on behalf of the Unity Museum, which is a Baha'i perspective on peace, in our Uniting Hearts Academy, right across from the University of Washington, we want to thank you today. and like to think that maybe sometime in the future we may ask you to come back. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed right now, but I have a feeling that Christina is very sort of hooked on you.
Oh, I am. I am.
Okay, well, I'll be happy to help another time then, okay?
Oh,
All right,
Dr. Maneck,
well,
thank you.
thank you all then.
Oh, Dr.
So
Maneck,
are we signing off then?
oh, I want to ask one question. Would it be okay? You did such a beautiful job on that PowerPoint. Are you comfortable sharing that? I can give it to my students.
Um, if I can
If you're
figure
not,
out how
that's
to do
okay.
that. I'm comfortable with it. I guess I can. Why don't you email me something, and I guess I can email it to you, right?
right,
Absolutely. That sounds fantastic.
I
I'll
probably
do
won't
that.
do it tonight, though, because it's really
No
late
worries.
here.
right.
Yeah, no worries. No worries at all. Thank
In
you.
fact, I'm probably going to have to ask one of the, yeah, I did this in my office at work, so I'm probably going to have to ask one of the workmen to walk me out. Jackson State isn't exactly the best part of town.
So I'm glad that you're doing that. Whenever I'm at work late, I always ask security to call security to ask for an escort. That's the safe thing to do.
Okay, great. All right, thank you very much then.
Thank you very,
Thank
very
you, Dr.
much.
There we go.